The RTX 5080 is possibly the dumbest graphics card to buy in the market right now. And yet, I'm so frustrated, which led me to make this video, seeing stuff like this. I'm constantly seeing people asking, should I buy a 5080 or a 5070 Ti? And the number of people giving the advice, the 5080 is absolutely worth it if you can afford it. You won't regret it. Whereas with the 5070 Ti, you might wonder what you could have gotten. Man, the number of people who fall into like the FOMO of the 80 class, branding, it's just absolutely insane because the 5080 is, what you might wonder what you could have gotten. Here is the realistic difference between a 5080 and a 5070 Ti. The fact is, it is about 14% more powerful. It is not a mind-blowing difference. So if you're doing something like trying to do path tracing in Cyberpunk 2077, RT Overdrive, DLSS quality mode, okay, the 5070 Ti can get 64 FPS. It does absolutely fine. The 5080 can get 73 FPS. It is a little bit better. It's about 14% better. But I need to make sure we understand what the pricing for these graphics cards actually is right now. A 5080 on the actual market costs over $1,200 for the least expensive model in the United States, whereas the 5070 Ti costs $780 for the least expensive model in the United States, and then there's a bunch of other models just a little more than that at about $800. That means if you look at this from a value perspective, you're spending about, I guess that was $1,220, there we go. You're spending about 56% more money to get a 5080 instead of a 5070 Ti to get 14% more performance. Now, I think when a lot of people answer the question on subreddits and things like that, they might not be aware of the real world pricing, because if you look at the MSRPs at $1,000 versus $750 for the two models, it's about 33% more money for the higher end card. Now, 33% more money for 14% more performance is still worse value, it's diminishing returns, but that's a more typical level of diminishing returns for the high end cards, as opposed to 56% more money for 14% more performance. And when I'm saying 14% more performance, I'm not just pulling that number out of nowhere. It's based on this testing. So running the 5080 and the 5070 Ti through a whole bunch of demanding gaming situations, it is sometimes less than 10% faster, but that's likely in more CPU limited situations. This was using a 9800X 3D to avoid CPU bottlenecking as much as possible. But if you're somebody playing like 1080p esports games at low settings, it's possible that you won't really see any difference between the two cards due to system limitations. But in the majority of graphically demanding AAA games, we're seeing somewhere between 10 and 18% faster for the most part, with the geomean of the 5080 being 14% faster. So you are really only getting 14% more performance. We need to really understand how little that actually is. Again, let me go back to something like this. So look at it this way. If you're in a situation where the 5070 Ti is only getting you 35 frames per second, and you think that, oh man, what if I had just bought the 5080? Would that have solved my problems? No, you'd only be at 40 frames per second. It is not taking you from an unplayable experience to a suddenly very playable experience. That is not what 14% is. To make sure we understand this a little bit more, let's do a little bit more math. So if you were getting 50 frames per second in a game on your 4070 Ti, and you were like, man, I wish I had got the 5070 Ti, and you're like, man, I wish I had got the 5080, then all my problems would be solved. I'd have 60 FPS. Let's increase our 50 FPS by 14%. What do we get? 57 FPS. Is that more? Sure. Is it even 60 FPS coming from 50? No, it's not. So the point is that the real problem with the 5080 commanding such a price premium is the fact that it doesn't offer a noticeably different gaming experience. The majority of people, I'd be willing to bet, I haven't actually run this test, if I set up two otherwise identical PCs and monitors, one with a 5070 Ti and one with a 5080 set to the same graphics settings, and put them side by side and not running a frame rate counter, 14% is going to be hard for the average person to detect without running a frame rate counter. Not impossible. I think especially the more like esports gamers are going to feel a little bit of a responsiveness difference there, a little bit of a smooth difference. It's not completely unnoticeable, but it's hard to notice when not running a frame rate counter. So again, we're talking 50 FPS to 57 FPS. It's not taking you from an unusable experience to a suddenly amazing experience. That is just not what it does. Does it have any additional VRAM? No. They're both 16 gigabyte graphics cards. Does it have any new features or levels of frame generation or anything like that? No, it doesn't. So the point is, the 5080 is simply terrible value. But value at the high end, I understand, shouldn't be the only part of the conversation. Because why am I not calling out the 5090 for being the worst GPU of this entire generation when it does actually offer worse value? So let me explain it this way. So the 5090, well, maybe we should talk pricing for a second. How much does a 5090 cost? A 5090 should have an MSRP of $2,000, but it in fact has about $2,400 to $2,500 on the real market. Meaning, if we judge by MSRPs, it's meant to be twice as expensive as a 5080. And if we judge real world pricing, it's also about twice as expensive as the 5080. Is it twice as powerful? The answer is no, it is not twice as powerful. But here's the difference. At the absolute high end, what I'm really looking for here isn't necessarily the highest end product to offer better value, but for it to open up meaningfully different experiences. So look at this. If you were on a 4K display and trying to play the big path tracing titles like Cyberpunk, so 4K RT Overdrive DLSS quality mode using the new Transformer, DLSS 4 model, the 5080 is only good for 39 frames per second. I don't think the vast majority of high-end PC gamers are going to be super happy with the 39 FPS experience. Whereas the 5090 offers 64% more performance while costing twice as much money. So sure, that is worse value, but it also opens up a 64 frames per second experience, which means that the 5090 is very usable using DLSS quality on a 4K display in the biggest path tracing titles, whereas a 5080 is not. Now, to be fair, if you go down to performance mode, the 5080 can now open up a 60 FPS average. However, the more demanding areas of the game, like the newer expansion pack with Phantom Liberty and Dogtown, will certainly go below 60 FPS. The 5090 is cruising through the benchmark run with 92 frames per second. And I can tell you that, for one thing, is 90 FPS noticeably better than 60 FPS, even in single-player gaming? And the answer is absolutely yes. Noticeably smoother, and it has more headroom for the harder sections of the game. Also, if you then go ahead and kick on frame generation, both of them do get you to super high refresh rate experiences. The 5080 is at 183 FPS, but divide that by 4 for the actual real frame inputs, meaning that its responsiveness is now often around 50 milliseconds or upper 40 milliseconds of latency, whereas the 5090 is frequently around 30 milliseconds or the low 30 milliseconds of latency. So there's a big latency difference, and there can also be an image quality difference because the smaller gaps between the frames that are being interpolated for frame generation, the better they end up looking. Now, in super slow side-by-side footage like this, you don't necessarily notice too much of that. But in faster motion, it can actually matter. And also, if you have one of those like super high refresh rate displays, this will do a better job of maxing that out. So the 5090 offers an experience that the 5080 simply can't, whereas the 5080 compared to the 5070 Ti doesn't do that. Here's another look at the 5090 justifying itself by opening up experiences that the 5080 can't. Remember how we looked at the 5070 Ti struggling to run a path tracing mode, and the 5080 couldn't solve that problem. It took you from 35 FPS to 40 FPS if you were trying to run it at native resolution. Can the 5090 solve that same problem? Yes, it has 60% more performance here than the 5080, and that gives it 64 FPS when the 5080 is hitting 40 FPS. Now, am I saying that it's even a reasonable thing to do to run native resolution path tracing on a 5090? Not really, but the example is, in a situation where the 5080 got you to 40 FPS and the 5070 Ti was at 35, and it wasn't a meaningfully, it didn't fix the problem, does the 5090 fix the problem? Yes, it does. So while current games aren't really going to be pushing these cards at this level if you're willing to use upscaling, if you're talking about the longevity of the cards, the 5090 is absolutely going to justify itself in that kind of situation. It'll hang on a lot longer. But again, nowadays you can kick on DLSS quality on a 1440p display, and the 5080 is doing a great job at 73 FPS. But again, the 5070 Ti was still giving you a good experience. But also the 5090, well, actually occasionally getting CPU limited in this benchmark because path tracing actually uses a lot of CPU, and this is, it's not super held back, but it's still hitting triple digits here compared to 73. So again, still a noticeably faster experience. But what about more on that longevity front? Now, do I really worry about the longevity of the 5080? I mean, not particularly so. But the 5090, again, is actually giving you additional things like VRAM capacity. The 5090 has 32 gigabytes of VRAM. The 5080 has 16. So in certain productivity workloads or AI workloads, the 5090 is already able to take advantage of that VRAM capacity. And there are certain situations where games can, at extremely high graphics settings, but can go beyond 16 gigabytes of VRAM. I don't know why I just minimized that screen there for a second. Sorry, guys. Let's see if I had some of it here. Yeah, so right here. So if I want to play 4K maxed out, but using DLSS performance mode in a game like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, the 5080 actually stutters to 3 frames per second, whereas the 5090 cruises right along at 82 FPS. Now, yes, you just minorly turn down the texture cache 1 notch on the 5080 and you're fine, but on the 5090, you just don't have to worry about that. The 5090 is the only true just max everything out and forget about it graphics card, whereas the 5080 can't do that. So once again, there's that piece. Now, do I expect 16 gigabytes of VRAM to be an issue anytime soon in gaming? Well, not really a major problem, but I think that the VRAM usage targets for games tends to take a major jump when there's a new console generation, because I think that a lot of core game design for the core visual design is based on the console target. So right now, games are targeted at the PlayStation 5, which has 16 gigabytes of unified memory. Some of that needs to be reserved for system stuff and general RAM purposes. So usually about 12 gigabytes or so can be allocated for VRAM-related tasks, which is why when we saw the cross-gen period fade away and games being designed around the PlayStation 5 level as its base target, we started seeing 8 and 10 gigabyte graphics cards start to have a lot of issues, whereas 12 gigabyte graphics cards are still mostly okay. Well, we're expecting the PS6 generation of of hardware coming in, maybe 2027-ish, right? I don't have a crystal ball and know the exact future. Well, in 2027 or so, getting that PS6 generation, I absolutely expect to have more RAM than a PS5. Now, how much? Probably 24, according to the latest rumors. Maybe it could be 32 or something like that. But if PS6 has 24 gigabytes of system RAM, it's unified memory, I would expect that more than 16 gigabytes of that could be allocated to VRAM-related purposes. And with that being the case, we could see that it's possible that games, if you wanted to target PS6 levels of graphic settings, the base core design of that game, it's possible that those settings could target more than 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Again, I don't have a graphics, crystal ball, and I also expect the cross-gen period of PS5 and PS6 to be very extended. So I expect that 16 gigabytes of VRAM on a 5080 will still be extremely easy to use, and tweak settings to be just fine on. I don't expect it to be a major issue, but again, situations like this where you can't just click max graphic settings and be okay on 16, I expect to become more and more common once the PS6 generation comes out. So in general, what I'm trying to get at here is, at the absolute high end, no. Actual just value performance per dollar is not the be-all and end-all of what you should look for in a graphics card. However, you also shouldn't just be completely stupid about it. The 5090 is worse performance per dollar than a 5080, but it opens up meaningfully different experiences, has additional VRAM, which is useful now in limited situations and will probably continue to be more useful as time goes on. Whereas if you're going to buy a 5080, you might as well buy a 5070 Ti instead and save yourself a lot of money. Now, that being said, I do think there's some caveats where the 5080 could make sense. Again, one is if you can find it at its MSRP. If it was actually available at $1,000, sure, it's still worse value than the 5070 Ti, but like I said, a more typical diminishing returns kind of situation for the high end, rather than getting just a ridiculous markup for a very hard to notice performance increase. So yeah, if you could find one at MSRP, and they do pop up every now and then, that's not completely terrible. But yeah, at current pricing, it's pretty hard to recommend, other than if you're doing a whole PC build, you do need to think of it kind of in that context as well. So one thing I want to mention is that, for example, if you're doing a full PC build, and let's say you were getting like a 9700X CPU from AMD, so you've kind of slotted that in as your CPU platform, and then you've got your, your 5070 Ti in there. Okay, we've slotted that in. There's your CPU and there's your GPU. Okay, we're spending about $1,000 on that. We got to factor everything else into the build, get some good memory and all of that. Here's what I want to make sure everybody understands. So if we go up to the 5080 from here, because let's say that your build budget wasn't maxed out, you still have more money to spend on your build. What should you spend it on? I'd recommend that in this situation, it's going to be better, especially if you have any interest in like esports type titles where you're shooting for super high frame rates, it's going to be better to upgrade to a 9800X3D CPU and get the most powerful CPU on the market for gaming. Because that's only, what, less than a $200 jump doing that, rather than jumping to the 5080. Because again, this just bumped the build up to about, $1,230 for the Core 2 components. Whereas jumping up to the 5080 would have been a bigger jump than that, right? Now, let's say you already have the 9800X3D, you've already paired it with the fastest memory, you've already got a high quality power supply, everything else is just cosmetic, and now you have more money on your build. Well, it is true then that if you have more money to throw at the build, throwing it at a 5080 does get you more performance, and it's not completely negligible. But please make sure you've maxed out everything else performance related in the build before making that decision. Don't throw in a 5080 and have to cut corners on anything else when you could have just gone with a 5070 Ti and maxed out the rest of the build. That's my overall opinion on the 5080, and why I would call it the worst GPU of this generation based on current market pricing in the United States. That's the only other caveat here, which is I understand that other regions might have different pricing, and if the 5070 Ti and the 5080 are much closer in price in your region, it might not be as big of a disaster. But at current pricing in the United States, there's extremely limited reasons to buy a 5080. Make sure you've maxed out everything else in the build before considering it. And if you want a truly meaningfully different experience, there's the 5090, but I understand that that could still be out of your price range, even if $1,200 is not out of your price range. All right, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found the video useful and or interesting. If you disagree, what do you think is the worst GPU of this generation? Let me know in the comments section. Maybe there's an argument that it's the 5050. Anyway, I hope, maybe I should have gone with that. So, okay, a couple of honorable mentions. Honorable mentions for the generation, 5060 Ti 8GB, that probably just shouldn't exist. And then the RTX 5050 is also pretty bad value. So I could have made this same video and for other reasons talking about the 5060 Ti or the 5050. But I've really just seen the number of people recommending a 5080 over a 5070 Ti when explicitly asked, hopefully getting the expert advice on whether that is the better call. That just triggered me and I had to make a video about it. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.